Welcome to the debate. When you stand on the Waterlue Bridge, and it really is perhaps the finest vantage point in the entire capital, and you look down the River Thames, you might think you are looking at a single sprawling city. To your left, you see the iconic spires of Parliament and the London Eye. To your right, that dense upward-thrusting cluster of skyscrapers around St. Paul's Cathedral. But if you look closer at the source material, specifically the History of London section and the distinct area-by-area breakdowns, a different reality emerges. You aren't looking at one city. You're looking at two.
It's a tale of two hearts beating in one chest, often at very different rhythms. And we aren't speaking metaphorically here. We're talking about a literal, historic bifurcation that most visitors, miss entirely.
Precisely. On one side, we have the center of government, royalty, and law, Westminster. On the other, the center of commerce, trade, and finance, the city. And for our listeners who might not know the distinction, when we say the city, we're referring to the historic square mile, a distinct municipal entity with its own police force, its own Lord Mayor, and its own laws, completely separate from the rest of Greater London.
That's right. It's the engine room versus the throne room. One founded on Roman trade and, river mud. The other on royal decree and divine right.
And that brings us to the central question we're exploring today. Which of these two centers represents the true driving force and identity of London? Is it the political stability, the continuity, and the ceremonial tradition of Westminster?
Or is it the economic resilience and, frankly, the adaptability of the city?
I am the advocate, and I'll be arguing that Westminster, with the royal court, the Abbey, and Parliament, is the soul of the nation. It provides the cultural identity and the global stage that defines London to the world.
And I am the dissenter. And I come at it from a different angle. I'll be arguing that the Roman foundation, Londinium, the port and the financial engines of that square mile are the true heart. Without the wealth generated by the city, the capital quite simply wouldn't exist to house the king. This city is the parent. Westminster is just the expensive child that moved out to the suburbs.
That is quite the accusation to start with. But let's look at the timeline, because I think it actually disproves this idea of the city being the dominant force. If we look at the history of London in our text, a fundamental shift occurred in the mid-11th century. This is the moment London truly became a capital in the sense we understand it today. In 1050, Edward the Confessor made a deliberate, conscious decision. He established his court and his abbey at Westminster.
He moved upriver.
He moved to separate the seat of government from the noise, the smell, and the chaos of commerce. He created a precinct for the state. This wasn't just a relocation, it was the creation of a soul. Westminster became the stage for the nation's most critical moments. Since William the Conqueror in 1066, every single coronation has taken place at Westminster Abbey. This is where the holy aspect of the monarchy resides. Furthermore, it's the seat of law. The Houses of Parliament, standing on the site of the old Palace of Westminster, they represent the evolution of our democracy. When you look at the Whitehall and Westminster section of our material, it describes stately avenues in monumental architecture. You have the Cenotaph, Downing Street, the Treasury. This is where the state lives. Without this centralization of power and law in Westminster, London would be nothing more than a trading post. A wealthy market, perhaps, but not a capital city.
I see why you'd think that, especially when you focus on the pageantry. But let me give you a different perspective. You speak of 1050 as the beginning, but that ignores 1,000 years of history. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that Westminster is the foundation. We have to go back to the true beginning, 55 BC and AD 43. The Roman London section of our text makes it absolutely clear. London is the city. The Romans didn't build their administrative headquarters, their forum, or the first bridge in the marshes of Westminster. They built them in the city.
Because it was a convenient crossing point for a military garrison? Nothing more?
It was a thriving metropolis. By the 3rd century, the population was 50,000 people. The Romans established the Forum and the Basilica, the town hall and courts of justice, right there in the city.
This area has its own distinct governance and a history of independence that, it predates the parliamentary system you value so highly. The city appointed its first mayor in 1191. That's institutional memory that rivals the crown. And consider the basic concept of survival. The Great Fire of 1666 section describes how the city was wiped out. 13,000 houses destroyed, and what happened? It rebuilt itself. It rose from the ashes, symbolized by Rennes' St. Paul's Cathedral. That dynamism, that ability to regenerate through commerce and trade, that's the engine that allowed the capital to survive. Westminster spends the money, the city makes it.
You're reducing a nation to a balance sheet. I think you're confusing economic activity with civic soul. Let's dig deeper into this issue of origins and legitimacy, because I think there is a distinction between a settlement and a capital. You mentioned the Romans, and of course I acknowledge that physical start. But we're debating the identity of London.
The identity is rooted in the name itself. Londinium, that is the root of the name and the place. The text highlights the physical foundations, the fragments of the Roman wall near the Museum of London, the Temple of Mithras. These aren't just ruins, they're the DNA of the city. The trade that flowed through that first bridge created the population.
But a population is not a nation. The identity shifted in 1050 because the spiritual legitimacy moved. The holy aspect of London is exclusively in Westminster. The text describes the glorious medieval architecture of the Abbey. This includes the shrine of Edward the Confessor. This became a pilgrimage site, a place of sanctity. The legitimacy of power, the divine right of kings, and later the sovereignty of Parliament resides here. It does not reside in the marketplaces of the East.
Does it not? Some argue that legitimacy comes from utility and power, and money is power. You mentioned the royals, but let's look at the nuance here. Even the royals relied on the city's wealth. The text notes that while Edward moved the court in the city, tradesmen set up their own institutions and guilds. These guilds were distinct from the power of the crown. They were the ones ensuring the city functioned. In fact, isn't there a tradition, it's mentioned in the guide, where the monarch to this day has to stop at the Temple Bar boundary when entering the city to be formally welcomed by the Lord Mayor?
A ceremonial pause, yes.
A symbolic submission. It symbolizes that the king's power has limits where the city's rights begin. The city is the only entity in the UK that could look the crown in the eye and negotiate. That is true legitimacy, independence.
It is a partnership, I'll grant you that, but one where Westminster sets the rules of the game. The history of London explicitly states that London was the obvious choice for national capital by 1066, but the machinery of that capital, the Domesday Book, the first Parliament in 1240, that machinery was housed in Westminster. The city is a place of ledgers. Westminster is a place of laws, and laws are what separate civilization from a bazaar.
Laws are useless without the capital to enforce them. But let's look at how this identity is expressed physically. You mentioned monumental architecture earlier. I'd like to challenge the idea that Westminster's architecture represents the true living London.
I accept that challenge gladly. The architecture of Westminster is a reflection of permanence and tradition. Look at the Houses of Parliament. They were rebuilt by Charles Barry in 1834 after a fire, yes, but in a neo-Gothic style designed specifically to, as the text says, overawe with pomp.
Mock Gothic. It was a theme park version of the Middle Ages built in the 19th century. It was looking backward.
It is looking at continuity. Big Ben, or the Elizabeth Tower, is perhaps the most recognized symbol of the United Kingdom worldwide. It has kept time for the nation since 1859. And consider the scale of the government buildings along Whitehall. The Treasury, the Foreign Office, these are massive, classical structures. They convey stability. They tell the citizen and the visitor, the state is here and it is solid. That is the identity of a capital. It provides a coherent narrative. When you walk through Westminster, you feel the weight of history in the stone itself.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that a city that only looks backward is a museum, not a living entity? Westminster is frozen in amber. The city champions an eclectic and resilient architecture that reflects reality. In the city, you have the juxtaposition of the old and the aggressively modern. You have St. Paul's Cathedral, Wren's masterpiece, the second largest dome in the world, standing just streets away from the postmodernist emblem of the Lloyd's building.
A building that looks like an oil refinery. It has its pipes on the outside.
Because it wears its function on its sleeve. Richard Rogers' design emphasizes structural honesty. It's a machine for working in. And it's not just Lloyd's. The text mentions the Gherkin by Norman Foster and the Shard by Renzo Piano. This skyline tells a story of adaptation. While Westminster is sticking to its Gothic revival fantasy, the city is building the future. The financial district skyscrapers show that London is still a global contender. The city embraces the new while respecting the old. That's a far more accurate reflection of London's true nature than the static stone of Whitehall. The city is messy, yes, but it is alive.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because eclectic can often mean incoherent. Westminster offers a unified face to the world, but let's discuss that narrative in the context of our third point: tragedy, resilience, and the people. You mentioned the Great Fire earlier as a point of pride for the city.
I did, and it is crucial. The city bears the scars of real life in a way Westminster often escapes. The Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of 1666 centered on the city. The text tells us 13,000 houses were lost. The city was virtually wiped out. That is total devastation. And yet, the merchant class, the common Londoner, they rebuilt it. They didn't flee, they reconstructed. Then jump forward to the Blitz in 1940 and 1941. The bombing devastated many central areas, but particularly the city and the docks. The city represents the resilience of the people who kept the economy running while bombs fell. The city burned so the nation could survive.
I do not deny the suffering of the city, but I would frame the resilience of Westminster differently. Westminster bore the weight of leadership during those times. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about directing the survival of the free world. The text highlights the Cabinet War Rooms and the Churchill Museum. This is a warren of rooms where the government operated underground.
Safely underground.
Essential leadership requires security. Winston Churchill sat at his desk there plotting military strategy while the bombs you speak of were falling above. That is the resilience of the state. If the city burns, it is a tragedy. If Westminster falls, the war is lost. Furthermore, the high stakes of political evolution played out in Westminster. The execution of Charles I took place outside Banqueting House in 1649. That was a traumatic restructuring of the nation's soul happening right on Whitehall. And where do we mourn? The cenotaph, completed in 1920. The text calls it a suitably bleak and pale monument. It is the focal point for national mourning on Remembrance Day. The nation looks to Westminster to process its grief and its history, not to a bank in the city. The emotional heart is in the West.
The nation looks to Westminster for the ceremony, I grant you that, but they look to the city for their livelihood, which leads us to the expansion of influence. You claim Westminster is the center, but let's look at the growth of the city. Did it not rely on the city to expand?
Actually, the physical expansion of what we consider High London, the West End, grew directly out of Westminster, not the city. The Piccadilly and St. James's section is clear on this. Aristocrats began laying out elegant squares, Grosvenor, Hanover, Berkeley, specifically to be near the court of St. James.
Because that's where the favors were dispensed.
Because that is where the culture was. The cultural life described in our material. The theaters, the Royal Academy of Art established in 1768, the gentlemen's clubs on Pall Mall, all of this stems from the royal presence. The West End as a concept of leisure, art, and society is a satellite of the palace, not the port. The fashionable London described in the Georgian section, with its stylish housing by Nash and Soane, was built for those connected to the governance of the realm. If London were left to the city, it would be a dockyard. Westminster gave it style.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the aristocracy built that society on their own. Where did the money come from? The text mentions a prosperous middle class created by the explosive growth of commerce and industry. That commerce came from the docks, east of the city. The city provided the capital. Westminster just found creative ways to spend it.
Creative ways to spend it? You mean creating the British Museum, the National Gallery, and the Royal Academy?
I mean that the wealth that allowed those aristocrats to lay out those squares was generated by the global trade networks managed from the city. The stock exchange was formally established in 1802. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. These are the engines. The West End is simply the garden where the city's money went to bloom. Even the Great Days in London itineraries in our guides suggest that a visitor's day often involves spending money in the West End that was likely generated through the financial markets of the East. You are taking credit for the spender, but forgetting the earner.
That is a reductionist view of culture, implying it is only a byproduct of money. Culture is also a byproduct of patronage, tradition, and stability, which the Crown and Parliament provided. You can have all the money in the world, but without the stability of law and the continuity of the state, which Westminster provided, you don't get the Royal Academy. You just get a wealthy fortress.
Stability is good, but stagnation is fatal. The city prevents stagnation. When the empire faded, Westminster lost its geopolitical dominance. But the city, it reinvented itself as the global financial hub. It didn't need the empire, it just needed a market. That adaptability is why London is still a Tier 1 city today, unlike, say, Vienna or Rome, which are beautiful museums of former power.
That is a harsh comparison, though perhaps there's a grain of truth in it. We are reaching the end of our time, so let us attempt to summarize these positions.
I come back to my central thesis. Westminster provides the face of the postcard. The guide is full of pictures of Big Ben, the Queen's carriage, the beefeaters. But the city provides the pulse. From the Roman port handling goods from the empire to the modern stock exchange, London is fundamentally a commercial entity that tolerates a government. The city adapts. It burned down and rebuilt. It was bombed and rebuilt. It saw the loss of the docks and built Canary Wharf. It is the survivor. It is the real London because it lives in the real world of risk and reward.
And I maintain that commerce exists in every major city on Earth. New York has Wall Street, Frankfurt has its banks, Shanghai has its trade, but London is unique because of the royal and political continuity found in Westminster. The narrative thread that holds this city together is the continuity of kings and queens listed in our text from William I to Elizabeth II and beyond, the continuity of Parliament sitting since the 13th century. That sense of history, enshrined in the stone of the Abbey and the rituals of the state, is what makes London London. It is a city of laws, not just ledgers. It is the city of God and government.
Perhaps the truth lies in the tension. As we look at the Great Days in London section, it suggests itineraries that cross these boundaries constantly. You visit the Tower of London, technically a royal fortress, but physically in the city in the morning, and Westminster Abbey in the afternoon.
That is a fair point. The two hearts are perhaps not enemies, but partners in a very long, sometimes difficult marriage. The tension between the money and the crown is likely what saved London from stagnation. If it were only Westminster, it might be a museum. If it were only the city, it might be a soulless industrial park.
The guide shows us that to understand the whole, you must traverse both. You need the view from the London Eye, seeing the Parliament, and the view from the Monument, seeing the city's skyline. One looks at how we rule, the other at how we live.
Indeed. We leave it to you, the listener, to decide. Is London defined by the deal or the decree? Is it a city of gold or a city of laws?
Or perhaps, it's simply the only place on Earth where you can have both within a boat ride down the Thames.
Thank you for joining the debate.